Hi, I'm Mark Daler and I'm a Sony Imaging Ambassador, and welcome to the Sony FE 50mm f1.4 G Master lens review. Now, the first thing that I was really excited to find out when I was opening the pre-production box was what was the size of this lens going to be. And I was really pleased to find out that it looks almost identical in size to the 35mm f1.4 G Master, which of course was welcomed for its diminutive size with that such a wide 1.4 aperture. So it doesn't look out of place on a E-mount camera, and it also looks great on the smaller compact A7C camera, as you can see over there on the right. So I think the form factor is the first big win here. It's going to please photographers who would prefer to work with maybe a wrist strap, which is myself, and also people who want to mount this lens on a gimbal to be shooting video. Now, some of you might be saying around now, don't Sony already have some 55mm primes? And yes, you would be right, there are actually 6 other 55mm lens in this category. So we have on the left there, we have that 50mm bargain basement f1.8. Its focus speed is not as quick as I need for shooting events where the subjects are often moving around quite quickly. We then have the 2.8 macro, which is a cheaper alternative to the 90mm macro, probably more suited for copy work, such as I'm copying my analog film. Again, the focus speed is not as quick as I need. We then have the excellent G lens, which is that compact lens, and obviously this is going to find a home for people who need the smallest possible lenses and are prepared to sacrifice one extra stop to get that smaller compact size. We then have the classic 55mm Zeiss, one of the original 3 E-mount full-frame lenses. Now, the price point hasn't changed for this lens in 10 years, so every year it gets more and more of a bargain for people who want a pin-sharp 55mm prime lens. Now, it doesn't have the bells and whistles. It's got no aperture ring, focus hole button, AF/MF switch, but it is a bit of a classic in that it does deliver in optical performance. So any new lens in this category is going to have to deliver. We then have almost the forgotten child, which is the Zeiss f1.4 lens, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this lens just shortly. And then we have the 50mm f1.2 with its quad linear XD focus motors, a really fast lens. First off, I'll just say that if anybody owns that Zeiss 1.4, it does deliver on the sharpness front. Some people may say, well, its corner sharpness isn't up to G Master standards, but for portrait shoots where you're not putting the eye of the model right in the corner of the frame, this lens does deliver in my opinion. And so it really is about the 50mm 1.4 coming in with those new linear XD focus motors, and of course it is also smaller. Now, a lot of people would have been expecting the 85mm 1.4 G Master to be updated. We've seen the 2470 and the 7200 Mark II versions of the G Master lenses, and now those have got the new linear XT focus motors. So this is now one of the older G Master lenses with the slower focusing motors there. So I would expect this to come, but of course it's not the lens on review today, but I would expect it to appear sometime soon, hopefully, because an 85mm prime is one of my favorite focal lengths. As I said, the 50mm will join a very large G Master stable there, and it is finding a particular home, and I'll talk about why we're seeing this lens at this particular time. First off, if you've already purchased the f1.2, now a lot of people will have purchased this f1.2 whilst waiting for the 85mm Mark II lens, and it does deliver on the focus speed, and it also delivers a better bit of bokeh, as you can see from these shots. Yes, it's not the 85mm focal length, so when I'm using this for head and shoulder portraits, I just find myself taking half a step a little bit closer to get that really shallow depth of field. Now that 1.2 is a significantly larger lens than the 1.4, but even this was compared or considered to be a very small f1.2 lens. If we look at it in comparing it to that Nikon f1.2, you can see it's much smaller and lighter than the Nikon offering, and of course it does deliver on the focus speed there, so much so that some people accused me of having this cyclist static when recording this, but as you can see from the series of shots on the left, I'm actually panning with this cyclist in this triathlon event. And if we zoom into 100% magnification, you'd expect a G Master to deliver on the sharpness front, and of course the 1.2 does indeed deliver here. So why? Again, I'm going to ask this question several times. So why a 50mm f1.4 G Master when we already have an excellent 1.2? Okay, so the 1.4 aperture is still 2 stops wider than a GM 2.8 zoom, and that is significantly wider if you're looking for lowering the ISO and also increasing the bokeh, or creating figure ground separation so we blur the background. It's also got a 2 times faster focus speed than the Zeiss Design 1.4, and this is going to be significant if, like me, your portraits are not standing still to be photographed. So here is the 50mm 1.4. We've got a 100% magnification, and this guy is on the move. This guy is on roller skates, and as you can see here, I've cropped in from the full frame view there, shooting this with the Alpha 7R5. So plenty of rich detail, pin sharp, very fast shutter speed. I think the shutter speed would have been 1/2000th of a second to freeze the moving action. And again, there were no triathlon events during this review period, but I've been shooting cyclists on my local cycle path. And again, we zoom into 100%. And yes, this 50mm 1.4 does deliver, as you'd expect from any late model G Master lens. Now, I did find some action, and this is going to be a feature of this lens review. You'll see that I'm shooting wide open and I'm shooting moving subjects. So if you're looking at any other lens reviews, you probably want to question why the other photographers are not shooting wide open and fast moving subjects, because that really is the raison d'etre of a 1.4 G Master with linear XT focus motors. And as you can see, these girls are photographed pin sharp. So again, I went out the following morning just looking for anything that moves, so just hogging the bicycle paths, looking for people coming close to the camera. Again, using my action settings, 1/2000th of a second, wide open at f1.4 to give me that figure ground separation that I'm looking for in this particular instance. Quickly pulling focus to the cyclist that was behind that leading cyclist, so quickly moving focus point to my next subject. Someone running along the same cycle path and somebody on electric scooters, and I made a little bit of feature of photographing everybody that was coming over this bridge in Melbourne called Webb Bridge, and all delivered pin sharp, no miss shots in this instance from this lens. And it didn't really matter how quickly the subject is moving, this lens can pretty much track. As long as you're using a late model alpha, you're going to be rewarded with very sharp images of fast moving subjects. If I just go back to that one, I'm shooting 1.4, and you'd expect to see a little bit of color fringing on some lenses shooting wide open. Now, there was a little bit of color fringing that I have corrected in post-production, but it's not significant. You are going to have to zoom in to actually notice it. I think the color fringing is perhaps not as good as the 135 G Master, but better than the 85 1.4 G Master. Okay, so a fast focusing prime lens like this does allow photographers to shoot from the hip in a street situation. So I'm just going to show you some street photographs where I'm not raising the camera to the eye. I'm just relying on the autofocus of the camera and lens combo to actually nail the shots I'm looking for. Now, I would often do this with a 35mm G Master, and the 35 is up to this task, but it does require that you actually get very very close to your subject. So some people would actually find the 50mm focal length just a little bit more comfortable because you're just putting yourself at a little bit of greater distance from your subject when shooting them. So here are from the hip or from the waist or from the chest shots taken using the monitor to frame up these shots. Now I'm walking towards this guy is walking towards me, so we've got a combined passing speed that's not insignificant at close range. This one's a little bit straighter, and as you can see, slightly lower vantage point because the camera is at chest height. Now this one is actually shooting with the Alpha-1. Yes, the lens can keep up with those 30 frames per second, and I can do a quick burst here because as I said, I'm moving past this subject quite quickly, and I'm going to take out the best framing from the shot. They're all going to be pretty much sharp with the Alpha-1. I'm just going to pick the best framing from that sequence. Now I'm walking up towards the steps of this railway station, just passing this guy on his mobile phone, rattle off 3 or 4 shots and pick the best framing, knowing that they're pretty much all going to be sharp. Here I'm crossing the road. This young woman has noticed me, or has she noticed the camera? Not too sure. I'm shooting with the Alpha-1 in the electronic shutter with the shutter sound switched off, so people don't really know whether I've photographed them or not. And going into one of the laneways inside of Melbourne, and of course having that wider aperture for low ISO starts to pay dividends here now compared to a zoom. So some people who are owning primes and maybe can't afford all primes will be questioning, well, should I go for the 35 1.4 G Master or the 50mm G Master or the 85 1.4 G Master? Which sort of lens would suit me? Now, until the 85 is updated, I'd probably lean people towards the 35 and 50. Now, the 85 I do like for those head and shoulders portraits, but of course we just need to step one step closer to get that head and shoulders portrait. I always engage somebody in conversation before I commit to taking a photograph, because if you just ask them straight out, can I take your photograph, you'll find that most of the time people will often just say no. Whereas if you've had a conversation, get to know their name, why they're in the laneway, and then ask to get their photograph because you say they look great, 9 times out of 10 people will switch to saying yes. So here I've got the full figure portrait. We've still got some background blur, as you can see, going down that laneway behind this guy, and as we move in close you can see the figure ground separation is really very good. We're getting that 85mm shallow depth of field look with a 50mm prime, and that's the reason that many people will lean towards this 1.4 or maybe the 1.2 aperture. And if I go in a little bit closer, you can see how blurred the ears are. Now, this is not everybody's look. A lot of people will stop down as they get closer. But of course, if you're wanting maximum figure ground separation, you want the wall this guy is leaning against to be blurred, then you will lean towards that 1.4. Sometimes, you know, if you want the whiskers on the chin as sharp as the lips, as sharp as the eyes, you will possibly stop down to even to F4 or smaller. But of course the beauty of owning one of these 1.4s is we do have the choice. The other thing is, if you want that head and shoulders portrait and you're using one of the higher resolution sensors, I'm thinking any sensor with a resolution of 33 megapixels or higher, we can always crop in much tighter in post-production to get that double page spread or 4K tight head and shoulders shot, as I'm showing here. And of course, as we move back, the depth of field will increase a little bit, so we are going to get all of that face in pin sharp focus, even using that wider 1.4 aperture. Getting a little bit closer now. These are not cropped, so we're going in with 1.4. You know, I would shoot this with a 35mm as well if you're wanting steeper perspective, but you are going to have to get quite close, and you will find that lots of people start noticing you with the camera a lot earlier when you're shooting with a 35mm at a closer range than say the 50mm. Okay, so as you can see here, we're getting again pin sharp images with people on the move in the city, and again slightly lower vantage point here. Again, the camera is lower down to the chest, again using the monitor to get a rough framing, and then just doing some minor straightening in post-production. Now this guy has noticed the camera, but the camera isn't at my face, so it's difficult to tell whether he's noticed the camera or me, but there's only a 1 second engagement. Occasionally I will then smile at somebody and engage them in conversation, which then allows me to move that 2 steps closer to get that tighter head and shoulders portrait. Okay, we're working into an alleyway now, which is a covered alleyway, so this is getting quite dark in here. So we're using the maximum 1.4 aperture to its maximum benefit. I would suggest that we're actually moving out of zoom territory now with those f2.8, f4 point apertures. So I'm actually shooting this at ISO 4000 with an f1.4 aperture. So had I been shooting with this with a 2.8 zoom, it would have been ISO 16,000. And if I'd been shooting it with an f4 zoom, it would have been 32,000. Now, some people will have different pain thresholds when they're dealing with noise and dynamic range. I am reasonably comfortable with shooting at ISO 5000, 6400. So I would prefer to get the ISO down to those levels and then maybe use a program such as DxO Pure Raw 2 or the Topaz denoise software just to clean it up a little in post-production. But of course, if we start pushing up to 16,000 or 32,000, we are going to start losing dynamic range and fine detail. And yes, we can recover a little bit, but not to the extent that we could recover detail at ISO 4000. So more than happy to use this and recommend it for street photography at night, as we can see here. Now, I don't normally use the images supplied by Sony to highlight the strengths of lens. A lot of the Sony images that they supply me do look a little bit like stock images, but I did identify two that I wanted to use, which I didn't have time during my review period to showcase, again, the value of a 50mm lens. And that is when we're working inside with window light, i.e. low ambient light, in the tighter confines of an interior of a regular living room or kitchen. So here we're working with a 50mm, where a 35mm you'll start getting a little bit of perspective distortion. 85mm you'll find yourself with the back against one of the walls in a smaller room. So the 50mm is a happy medium between the 35 and 85mm focal length. And perhaps that's highlighted even more with this second image of this young woman in the kitchen. As we can see, the photographer doesn't have their back up against the wall of the kitchen here, so it's a much more comfortable working distance, and we're still getting that great figure ground separation. So talking about close focusing, now Sony often prints the close focusing distance on the front of the lens, and I believe this is about 0.41 meters, but that doesn't really give you an idea of how much we can magnify the subject itself when we're photographing very small subjects. So I thought a better way of doing this, and I would actually prefer Sony to do this, is not to put the close focusing distance, but actually to print out the magnification factor. So the close focusing distance doesn't sound that too bad at 0.41 meters, but it's not a hugely impressive magnification factor at 0.16. So here's my little Daffy Duck here in the, you can see it's about the same height as the diameter of the E mount aperture there, and that's about as close as I can get to Daffy Duck in this particular instance with the 50mm 1.4. If we switch that out to a lens with a much more impressive close focusing distance, such as the 2070 G Master Mark II or the brand new FE2070 F4 G, which could possibly hold the record for the maximum magnification ratio that's not a macro lens, and that is 0.39 times magnification there. So I'll ask this question one last time. So why do we need a 50mm 1.4 G Master? Now, Sony might not list this as one of the reasons they've released a 50mm 1.4 G Master, but as an ambassador, not an employee, I feel comfortable in basically saying I've been watching Sony release better updated lenses to their lens lineup, which seemingly replace the older Zeiss design lenses. Now the 50mm 1.4 isn't going to replace the Zeiss design lenses, and in fact the all of these three lenses you see here have not been replaced. You can still buy these as current model lenses. But if we take a look at the 2015 35mm 1.4 Zeiss design prime, we did see that updated to the G Master, and that lens in the middle, the 1635, we've seen that replaced with not replaced, updated with an improved lens with better features, with the G power zoom lens. And obviously that power zoom lens is a feature that the older 1635 did not have. And then of course we've very recently seen the 2470 f4 Zeiss design lens. We've seen a new G lens which is 20-70, so it basically is smaller, and yet it has a wider focal range, going down to 20mm instead of 24. So we're seeing new G and G Master lenses which show improvements over the older Zeiss design lenses, and we haven't seen any new Zeiss lenses for many years now in Sony's lens lineup, and I'd be very surprised if we ever see a new Zeiss design lens in the Sony lens lineup. So if we look at 2021, when the 35mm, we saw that, and you see that that's updated features to the 2015 Zeiss. We basically saw a smaller and lighter prime lens, a sharper prime lens, a faster focusing courtesy of its XD linear focus motors, and more bells and whistles. And what do I mean by more bells and whistles? We're basically seeing focus hold buttons, and we're seeing AF/MF switches and D-click switches. Now the Zeiss design lenses never did feature those focus hold buttons, and those focus hold buttons are very good for people who also want to reassign them as a custom button in the Sony menus there. So we've seen the same treatment now occur with the 50mm 1.4. Now the new 50mm 1.4 is 30% lighter than that old Zeiss design lens, and it is a faster focusing lens courtesy of its dual XD linear focus motors. Just to show you that size comparison again, you're looking at that 50mm. Yes, it is slightly wider, but it's actually a few grams lighter than the 35mm G Master, and it's exactly the same height. Now you see that I've got a little bit of a freewell magnetic ring on the top of my 35mm, and I'll talk about the significance of the filter diameter, the 67mm filter diameter, very shortly. But we can see the comparative size is very close to that 35mm lens, and it even has a few more bells and whistles than the 35mm G Master, in the fact that we have an additional focus hold button for when we're shooting in vertical orientation, so it's a little bit more comfortable to find that focus hold button. And we also have an iris lock, so when the aperture ring is turned to A, we can lock that in position and then control the aperture from the camera with no risk of bumping that aperture. Okay, so if we take a look at the 24, 35 and 50mm G Master primes, you can see how similar in size they are, and they all share that 67mm filter thread. So if I put a magnetic filter ring onto the front of all three of these lenses, I can quickly move an ND filter across all three lenses without changing filter diameter. And I think this is no accident. I think Sony really wanted to achieve this constant 67mm filter thread across all three of these prime lenses, and videographers who use ND filters a lot will definitely appreciate this feature. So, and there is a quick screen grab of a Sony filter going onto one of these lenses. I would actually use the magnetic filters, so you can just quickly, without screwing the 67mm filter onto one of these lenses, you could just pull it off and put it on any other lens very quickly. So I borrowed this little video from Sony just showing some of the switching out lenses with the camera mounted. I think that's possibly the FX3 or FX30 camera there, and we're just showing these G Master primes being switched out. We currently have the 24 G Master in view there. It was all balanced up on that steady shot rig there, and now we're putting in the 35. Now the 35 is just a little bit heavy, so a small micro adjustment is required to get balance on there, but you can see how quickly that is. What's even more impressive is when we switch out the 35 to the 50mm G Master, the new G Master. You'll see they're so similar in length and also weight that no adjustment is actually needed at all. And again, I think that is a super impressive feature for anybody using these cameras on a rig. Here we are with the 50mm 1.4 alongside that 35mm again. If we take a look at maybe more traditional 1.4 offerings, they've got the 85mm over there on the left, the 50mm 1.2, the 50mm 1.4 Zeiss, and the new 50mm 1.4 Sigma. You can see that they're all a similar size weight to each other. Okay, but if we now throw in the 50mm 1.4, you can see it's almost like we've gone down a lens size category. That would certainly be borne out by the length, the filter diameter, and most significantly the weight. We're at least 100 grams, if not more, shaved off that weight there. So we've got perhaps a really impressive weight size performance for this new 50mm 1.4. So as I said, it's really about speed, weight and size. Finally, I'll conclude this lens review by just saying, if you don't own the 51.2 or an old Zeiss design 1.4 and you're trying to make up your mind whether you go with a 1.2 or the 1.4, then obviously the size, price and weight is one of the main factors, but I thought I would now show some side-by-side examples of me shooting with the 1.4 and 1.2 together. Now, if you're looking at the background blur and you're going, well, they look really similar. We're not getting significantly more blur from that 1.2. And you'll notice here I've just gone a fraction closer when using the 1.4, and that creates sort of a level playing field with the figure ground separation or amount of blur that you get behind your subject, because it's not all about aperture, it's also about how close you are to your foreground subject. So again, I can demonstrate that again with this dog that I shot on the pier. Is you'll see that I'm just a little bit closer with the 1.4, and that sort of evens out the bokeh behind the dog's head there. So yes, the 1.2 is going to deliver more background blur if you're just a little bit further away, okay, but there is always the option to get just a little bit closer with that 1.4. And is that enough background blur? I think 95% of photographers would possibly say yes, that's possibly enough background blur for me. So faster, lighter, smaller and sharper is the order of the day with the new 50mm 1.4 G Master. Now you can, I'm not going to talk through this slide, but I just grabbed this off the Sony slide deck here. Some people are interested in all of this information, and I may not have talked about all of this, but you're going to look at all of the selling points that Sony think are strong selling points for this lens. Okay, so if you found the information in this lens review useful, I would like to remind people who have not found this out before, is that I do write 500 and 600 page ebooks for all of the late model alpha cameras, and you can access this from patreon.com. There are also Q&A forums, there are 1 and 2 hour seminars for patron only videos basically, and I also have cam set files for late model alpha cameras. Camset files are camera setup files. You copy one to the memory card and you can set up your camera just by loading the camset file, and the camera would then be configured as per the 500 or 600 page ebook. Okay, so that concludes my 50mm f1.4 video review. Just subscribe if you haven't already done, give me the thumbs up, and I'll catch you online or on Patreon later. Cheers, I'm Mark Gaylor.